England, autumn of 1890. A cool evening mist drifted across the rolling hills and ancient woodlands of southern England, wrapping the countryside in a veil of silver before yielding to the glow of countless carriage lanterns. Beyond towering iron gates stood Ravenshire Hall, the Crown's most magnificent royal estate outside the capital, where the annual charity ball had gathered nearly every noble family of consequence. Its soaring towers of pale stone gleamed beneath a crescent moon, while thousands of candles shimmered behind enormous arched windows, turning the palace into a beacon visible for miles. Elegant carriages rolled steadily along the gravel drive, their polished wheels crunching softly as liveried footmen welcomed dukes, earls, ambassadors, military heroes, judges, physicians, and members of parliament. Inside, music floated through marble corridors scented with roses, polished cedar, and warm beeswax, promising an evening of celebration unlike any other. The grand ballroom dazzled beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered golden light across polished oak floors. Ladies in silk gowns glided gracefully through elegant waltzes while gentlemen in immaculate black evening coats bowed with practiced refinement. Laughter blended effortlessly with the orchestra's violins, and silver trays carried delicate pastries, fragrant tea, and sparkling crystal glasses through the sea of distinguished guests. Conversations flowed as naturally as the music, yet beneath the splendor lingered a single silent absence that everyone noticed before anything else. Near the edge of the ballroom, separated from the dancers by only a few yards but by an invisible wall no one dared cross, sat Duke Alastair Ravenscroft. His chair faced the dancers, though his eyes rarely followed them. At 37, he possessed the commanding presence of a man who had once led regiments through impossible battles and returned victorious when older generals expected defeat. His clean-shaven face was sharply defined, his dark hair neatly brushed back, and his tailored black evening coat fit him with effortless precision. There remained nothing outwardly broken about him. If anything, he appeared carved from polished granite, handsome, disciplined, and entirely unreachable. Beside him rested a small round tea table adorned with gleaming silver teapots, delicate porcelain cups, and untouched pastries. Next to his chair stood another. Empty. It had remained empty at every royal gathering for 6 long years. No servant ever placed another guest there. No noble ever requested it. No ambitious mother ever encouraged her daughter to occupy it. The empty chair had become as famous as the Duke himself. Nearby whispers floated carefully through the ballroom. They say his fiancée died after drinking poisoned wine. My sister insists his own family carried a curse. No, everyone close to him dies. I heard his younger brother never returned from a hunting expedition, and his mother wasted away from some mysterious illness. There was even a close friend who vanished without leaving a trace. Another voice lowered itself almost to a breath. Anyone foolish enough to stay beside him shares the same fate. The rumors changed with every season, yet they all reached the same conclusion. Stay away from the Duke. Across the ballroom, Miss Eleanor Ashcombe accepted a cup of tea she had little intention of drinking. At 26, she possessed the quiet elegance that drew attention only after one truly looked at her. Her ivory evening gown was modest beside the extravagant fashion surrounding her, its high collar and long fitted sleeves reflecting dignity rather than vanity. Chestnut hair had been gathered into a graceful braided bun, with a few soft curls framing thoughtful eyes that noticed details most people overlooked. She neither sought admiration nor feared being unnoticed. Her confidence came from years spent comforting wounded soldiers whose scars had taught her that appearances often concealed entirely different truths. Her father, Dr. Edmund Ashcombe, greeted fellow physicians across the room while discussing improvements for military hospitals funded by the evening's charitable donations. Eleanor listened politely before wandering toward the ballroom's quieter edge. She noticed people watching the Duke. She noticed people avoiding him. But more importantly, she noticed the Duke watching everyone else. There was no bitterness in his expression. No arrogance. Only distance. A loneliness so practiced it had become part of his posture. Just then an elderly servant struggled beneath the weight of an enormous silver tea service while attempting to navigate between crowded tables. His trembling hands slipped slightly against the polished tray. Several noblemen saw him. None moved. A pair of fashionable ladies frowned, worried more about spilled tea staining expensive gowns than the old man's shaking arms. Before the servant could stumble, the Duke quietly stood. Without calling attention to himself, he crossed the polished floor with measured steps, relieved the servant of the heavy tray, and carried it the remaining distance himself. He thanked the elderly man with a respectful nod, adjusted one crooked teacup, and returned to his own chair before the orchestra completed its next verse. Almost no one noticed, Almost. Eleanor had watched every moment. She stared at the Duke with growing disbelief. The man England described as cold had instinctively helped someone invisible to everyone else. Not for applause. Not because anyone important was watching. Simply because another human being needed help. The elderly servant blinked after him with grateful eyes, yet wisely returned to work without speaking. The Duke resumed his seat exactly as before. His expression remained unreadable. The empty chair beside him remained untouched. Eleanor felt every cruel rumor she'd heard begin to unravel. Perhaps people feared him because they had never bothered to truly see him. Her father approached quietly. "You've been staring toward his grace." "I've been observing him." Dr. Ashcombe followed her gaze before sighing. "Do not mistake solitude for invitation. You know him? I treated soldiers who served under his command. Every one of them respected him. They also said he never allowed anyone close after the tragedies." "The rumors?" "They're only rumors," her father answered carefully. "Whatever truly happened, it broke him." He rested a reassuring hand upon her shoulder. "Leave old wounds alone, Eleanor." Then he disappeared into another conversation. She remained standing. Across the ballroom the Duke lifted a teacup but never drank from it. For one fleeting second their eyes met. Instead of looking away in embarrassment, Eleanor offered the smallest, gentlest smile. The Duke seemed almost startled before lowering his gaze again. The orchestra began another graceful waltz. Couples filled the dance floor. Laughter returned. Yet Eleanor found herself unable to move. The empty chair seemed less like furniture now and more like a quiet prison someone had willingly entered years ago. She drew one slow breath. Then another. Ignoring every horrified glance that followed, she crossed the ballroom with calm, deliberate steps. Conversations faded one by one until even the violins seemed to hesitate. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her as she stopped beside the Duke's table. Offering a respectful curtsy, she met his guarded eyes without fear and asked softly, "May I sit with you?" Silence settled over the ballroom. The Duke answered just as quietly, "You shouldn't." A warm smile touched her lips. "I wasn't asking whether I should." Before another word could be spoken, she lowered herself into the empty chair, and from the shadowed balcony above, unseen by the crowd below, Lord Cedric Blackthorne watched the impossible happen. A slow, satisfied smile crossed his face as he whispered to himself, "Another one." Morning sunlight spilled across England's rolling fields, but peace never lasted long inside the walls of great estates. By dawn, the previous evening's impossible moment had traveled farther than any royal proclamation. Every breakfast table, every gentleman's club, every drawing room, and every village inn echoed with the same astonishing story. The mysterious lady who had calmly taken the empty chair beside Duke Alastair Ravenscroft had become the subject of endless fascination. Some admired her courage. Most questioned her sanity. Nearly everyone predicted she would soon regret her decision. Within 2 days, newspapers printed elaborate illustrations of the ballroom. Although artists had never witnessed the moment, they exaggerated every detail until Eleanor appeared almost legendary. Headlines declared, "The lady who defied England's loneliest duke," while columnists debated whether compassion or ambition had driven her across the ballroom floor. Eleanor ignored every article. She had not crossed the room to attract attention. She had crossed it because she could no longer bear watching loneliness disguised as dignity. The Duke, however, withdrew even further. Invitations arrived daily requesting his attendance at luncheons, hunting parties, and formal dinners where society hoped to glimpse the mysterious woman again. He refused everyone. His household politely informed callers that his grace remained occupied with estate matters. Only Eleanor received a handwritten note delivered by a trusted servant. "Please do not seek me again. It is safer for you that way." There was no signature. None was necessary. Eleanor folded the note carefully instead of discarding it. The handwriting revealed restraint rather than coldness, as though every letter had been written by someone fighting against his own heart. She slipped the page inside her favorite book and continued preparing medical supplies for the military hospital where she volunteered twice each week. The hospital stood on the edge of a quiet market town surrounded by ancient oaks and fertile farmland. Long stone corridors carried the scent of herbs, soap, and polished wood instead of despair because Eleanor insisted every ward remain filled with fresh flowers. She moved gently among recovering veterans, changing bandages, reading letters aloud, and encouraging men who believed their finest days had already passed. Many greeted her with grateful smiles that brightened even the darkest corners of the building. Late one afternoon she noticed several expensive wagons unloading crates marked only with a simple wax seal bearing no family crest. Curious, she asked the hospital steward who had funded such generous deliveries. "The same anonymous benefactor as always," the elderly steward replied. "Medicines, surgical instruments, blankets, wheelchairs, food, even wages for additional nurses. Whoever he is has saved more lives than most famous men." "Has no one thanked him?" The steward smiled sadly. "He refuses recognition." Over the following weeks, Eleanor quietly investigated without announcing her intentions. Everywhere she traveled, she discovered the same mysterious generosity. A village school had recently received new books. An orphanage welcomed warm beds before winter. Widows of fallen soldiers received monthly pensions from an unnamed donor. Rural clinics suddenly possessed modern medical equipment. Every trail ended with the same discreet steward, solicitor, or accountant who whispered identical words. The benefactor requested complete secrecy. Eventually one elderly accountant looked at Eleanor thoughtfully before speaking in a lowered voice. "If kindness leaves no signature, perhaps it was never intended to earn applause." He handed her a ledger only long enough for her to glimpse one familiar signature before gently closing it again. Alistair Ravenscroft. Nothing more needed saying. That evening Eleanor requested permission to visit Ravenscroft Manor under the respectable excuse of discussing charitable medical funding. The Duke received her in a quiet library lined with thousands of leather-bound books overlooking rain-soaked gardens. Firelight flickered across polished shelves while thunder murmured beyond tall windows. "You ignored my letter?" he said calmly. "I respected your concern," Eleanor answered. "I simply disagreed with it." His expression barely changed. "You should not involve yourself in my affairs." "I already have." Silence settled between them. Finally she placed the hospital ledger upon the table. "You've rebuilt lives without accepting a single thank you." He stared into the flames instead of the document. "Gratitude changes nothing. It changes the people receiving help." "I don't require gratitude." "What do you require?" For several moments he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness far older than his years. "Distance." Rain struck harder against the windows. "My fiancé died 6 years ago." Eleanor listened without interruption. "My younger brother died days later." His fingers tightened around the armrest. "My mother followed within months." The room seemed colder. "My closest friend disappeared before winter." He looked directly at Eleanor. "I reached the only conclusion left." She already knew the answer before he whispered it. "Anyone who comes close to me dies." She crossed the room until only the library table separated them. "I don't believe that." "You should." Before she could answer, a servant rushed inside, pale with alarm. "Your Grace, Miss Ashcombe's carriage has just departed." Eleanor frowned. "I dismissed it an hour ago." The servant swallowed hard. "Then someone else has taken it." Without another word, the Duke seized his coat and hurried outside. Rain lashed the estate as stable doors burst open. Moments later he and Eleanor rode after the stolen carriage through flooded lanes bordered by ancient hedgerows. Ahead, masked riders whipped frightened horses toward an aging stone bridge spanning a swollen river. The carriage swayed violently, one wheel lifting above the rushing water. Alistair urged his stallion forward with fearless precision, caught the reins inches before disaster, and dragged the terrified horses away from the crumbling edge. The attackers vanished into the storm before soldiers arrived. Shaken but unharmed, Eleanor stepped from the carriage. The Duke met her frightened eyes and said quietly, "Now you understand why I stay alone." That night she returned home to find nothing stolen, no window broken, no servant injured. Only 6 chilling words were written across her bedroom mirror in dripping black ink: "Leave the Duke, or die." Dawn arrived beneath heavy gray skies, yet the threatening message upon Eleanor's mirror lingered in her thoughts long after the ink had been carefully washed away. Fear would have been the sensible response. Retreat would have satisfied every warning the Duke had ever spoken. Instead, the danger clarified her purpose. Someone had spent 6 years destroying evidence, silencing witnesses, and keeping one terrible secret buried beneath respectable society. If innocent lives had already been sacrificed, allowing the truth to remain hidden would only invite another tragedy. Her father recognized the determination in her eyes before she spoke a single word. "You intend to investigate." "I intend to finish what others abandoned." Dr. Edmund Ashcombe sighed with quiet resignation. "Then promise me you will never search alone." She smiled faintly. "I'll promise to be careful." He knew it was the closest promise she could honestly make. Using his reputation among physicians, magistrates, and military officials, Dr. Ashcombe quietly opened doors that had remained closed for years. Together they visited county archives, hospital registries, coroner's offices, and forgotten record rooms where dust-coated shelves untouched since the previous decade. Eleanor carefully compared dates surrounding the deaths connected to House Ravenscroft. At first the documents appeared ordinary, but patterns slowly emerged beneath the surface. Lady Isabella's physician had resigned unexpectedly 3 days after her examination. The royal wine steward died from an unexplained fall within 2 weeks. A palace footman accepted a generous pension before disappearing overseas. The judge assigned to review the poisoning ordered every official report sealed, then retired months earlier than expected. Each event alone seemed unfortunate. Together they resembled deliberate erasure. Someone had patiently removed every person capable of revealing what truly happened. Eleanor shared her discoveries with the Duke inside Ravenscroft Manor's library as rain tapped softly against tall windows. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he remained silent for so long she wondered whether he regretted allowing her this far into his life. Finally he spoke. "I spent years believing grief had clouded my judgment. You were right to question everything. I had no proof. You have more than suspicion now." His gaze settled upon the fire. "I also have you standing in danger because of it." She stepped closer. "I made that choice." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No," he whispered. "You made the mistake of believing I deserved saving." Before Eleanor could answer, the library door opened. An elderly woman entered under the guidance of a footman. Her back was slightly bent with age, yet dignity remained in every careful step. The Duke immediately recognized her. Mrs. Hawthorne. She had once served as Lady Isabella's personal maid. Everyone believed she had retired to the countryside years earlier. Instead, she had lived quietly under another name. Her trembling hands clutched a small wooden box wrapped carefully inside faded linen. "I've hidden this long enough," she said softly. She placed the box upon the table. Inside rested a worn leather diary tied with pale blue ribbon. Lady Isabella's handwriting covered every page. The room became utterly silent. Together they read entries describing joyful wedding preparations, charitable plans, and growing affection for Alistair. Gradually the cheerful tone darkened. Isabella mentioned unfamiliar faces watching corridors, servants changing unexpectedly, and conversations stopping whenever she approached. She confessed feeling observed even during private walks through palace gardens. Several pages later she admitted fearing someone wanted the engagement prevented, though she could not explain why. The final written page ended abruptly. Its last unfinished sentence read, "If anything happens to me, never trust." The remainder had been violently torn away. The missing name transformed uncertainty into certainty. Someone had intentionally removed the most important clue. Mrs. Hawthorne lowered her head. "I found the diary hidden beneath her dressing table after the funeral." "Why wait 6 years?" Eleanor asked gently. "Because everyone else who knew something died." The words settled over the room with crushing weight. "I believed hiding was the only way to survive." The Duke carefully closed the diary. "You survived." "Barely." She looked toward Eleanor. "Now they're watching you instead." The warning proved terrifyingly accurate. Later that afternoon Eleanor requested access to the county archive where sealed parliamentary correspondence from the year of Isabella's death remained stored. The elderly archivist reluctantly unlocked an iron gate leading into lower vaults lined with towering shelves packed tightly with fragile ledgers and official reports. Dust drifted through narrow beams of afternoon light filtering beneath small windows. Every cabinet seemed to hold forgotten fragments of England's memory. Near the rear chamber Eleanor discovered an inventory listing one document removed without authorization 6 years earlier. Beside the entry appeared only 2 initials. CB. Before she could study further, shouting echoed above. Then came the unmistakable smell of smoke. Within seconds flames crawled across dry wooden shelves. Someone had barred the main entrance from outside. The fire spread with horrifying speed, feeding upon brittle paper accumulated through generations. Burning fragments floated through suffocating smoke as heavy beams groaned overhead. Eleanor wrapped a damp cloth across her mouth and searched desperately for another exit, but collapsing shelves blocked every passage. Heat intensified until breathing itself became painful. She stumbled against a cabinet, clutching Isabella's diary beneath her coat while sparks rained around her. Outside, stable boys saw smoke rising from the archive roof and raced toward Ravenscroft Manor. The Duke reached the burning building before local firefighters. Ignoring every shouted warning, he forced open a side entrance already engulfed in flames. Smoke swallowed him almost instantly. He called Eleanor's name again and again until her weakened reply reached him through collapsing corridors. Guided only by her voice, he crossed burning debris, lifted a fallen beam trapping her path, and found her kneeling beside scattered documents. Without hesitation he wrapped his coat around her shoulders and carried her toward the nearest staircase. Behind them the ceiling thundered downward, burying entire rows of records beneath blazing timber moments after they escaped into the open air. As exhausted firefighters extinguished the remaining flames, Eleanor slowly opened one soot-blackened folder rescued instinctively during the escape. Inside lay a physician's confidential report overlooked by whoever destroyed the archive. Beneath smoke stains remained one unmistakable conclusion. Lady Isabella had not accidentally poisoned herself. The deadly wine had originally been prepared for Duke Alastair Ravenscroft, and she died only because she unknowingly exchanged glasses with him. Alastair stared at the page in stunned silence, realizing the woman he had mourned for 6 years had sacrificed her own life to save his, while somewhere beyond the gathering crowd, unseen eyes watched their discovery with growing desperation. Night settled heavily over Ravenscroft Manor, yet no one inside the ancient estate found rest. The physician's report rescued from the flames lay upon the library table beside Isabella's diary, both protected beneath fresh linen despite the lingering scent of smoke. Duke Alastair Ravenscroft stared at the surviving pages as though they belonged to another lifetime. For 6 years he had carried unbearable guilt, believing his presence alone had destroyed everyone he loved. Now the truth had shifted beneath his feet. Isabella had not died because fate was cruel. She had died shielding him from a carefully planned murder. Eleanor remained beside him, refusing to leave despite the danger surrounding them. She watched grief transform into determination across his face. The lonely resignation that had imprisoned him for years slowly gave way to something stronger. If someone had orchestrated every tragedy, then that person could no longer hide behind whispered rumors and burned records. The dead deserved justice, and the living deserved freedom from fear. Dr. Edmund Ashcombe arrived before sunrise carrying documents gathered through trusted legal colleagues. Quietly spreading them across the table, he revealed property transfers, inheritance records, private banking ledgers, and correspondence recovered from government archives untouched by the fire. Individually they appeared harmless. Together they exposed a disturbing pattern. Every death surrounding House Ravenscroft had been followed by carefully timed financial changes benefiting one branch of the family alone. Lord Cedric Blackthorne. His name surfaced repeatedly. Small inheritances, temporary estate authority, investment control, voting influence within the family trust. Nothing large enough to attract suspicion. Everything significant enough to reward patience. Alastair studied each page carefully before speaking. If I had died unmarried 6 years ago, Dr. Ashcombe finished the thought. Lord Cedric would eventually have inherited the Ravenscroft fortune. Silence settled across the room. Eleanor slowly understood the horrifying brilliance of the conspiracy. The poison failed. Alastair nodded. So he changed his strategy. Instead of murdering the Duke directly, someone had dismantled his life piece by piece. His fiancée, his brother, his mother, his closest friend. Not random victims. Carefully selected losses. Each death pushed Alastair deeper into isolation until he willingly withdrew from society. A lonely duke who trusted no one became easier to manipulate than a happily married one surrounded by loyal family. Cedric had not merely attacked lives. He had shaped the duke's future with calculated cruelty. Determined to secure undeniable proof, they arranged a discreet meeting with Sir Reginald Mercer, an elderly magistrate who had quietly questioned the original investigation years earlier. Age had weakened his body but sharpened his conscience. Hidden within his countryside residence remained copies of correspondence he had secretly preserved after suspecting official evidence had been altered. The meeting never happened. Halfway through the journey, Sir Reginald's carriage was discovered overturned beside a woodland road. The old magistrate survived with minor injuries, but every document he carried had vanished. One frightened stable boy reported seeing elegant black coaches leaving the area moments before the attack. Each displayed the same silver falcon crest. The crest of Lord Cedric Blackthorne. By evening Parliament authorized discreet investigators to observe Cedric's movements without announcing formal accusations. The Duke understood why secrecy remained essential. A desperate man with immense wealth could erase evidence overnight. They needed more than suspicion. They needed confession. Cedric acted first. Returning from another visit to the Veterans Hospital, Eleanor noticed unusual silence along the narrow country lane leading home. Birds had stopped singing. Even the horses seemed uneasy. Before she could react, masked riders emerged from dense woodland, surrounding her carriage with frightening precision. This time they did not attempt murder immediately. Instead, they forced the frightened driver aside and carried Eleanor away before nearby farmers realized anything had happened. Hours later, a terrified messenger reached Ravenscroft Manor. The letter contained only one sentence: "Come alone if you wish to see her alive." Beneath the message appeared an abandoned abbey's location. Alistair read the note once, then quietly folded it. "I'll go." "You'll walk into a trap," Dr. Ashcombe warned. "I know." Eleanor would have crossed fire for him. He intended to do no less. Yet he did not ride alone. Without attracting public attention, he summoned trusted veterans who had once served beneath his command. They arrived without hesitation despite years spent rebuilding peaceful lives. Some walked with canes. Others carried scars impossible to hide. Every one of them remembered the commander who had never abandoned a soldier on any battlefield. As violent thunder rolled across England, the small company rode through driving rain toward the ruined abbey rising above dark cliffs. Broken stained-glass windows flashed beneath lightning while ancient bells swayed silently within the cracked tower. Wind howled through shattered arches, turning forgotten prayers into ghostly echoes. Inside the ruined sanctuary, Eleanor remained bound yet remarkably composed. Cedric stood before her dressed with perfect aristocratic elegance, untouched by the storm outside. His polished manners contrasted grotesquely with the poison bottle resting calmly upon a nearby stone altar. "You remind me of Isabella," he said pleasantly. "She underestimated me as well." Eleanor met his gaze without trembling. "You destroyed innocent people for money." Cedric smiled faintly. "For legacy." Hoofbeats echoed beyond the abbey walls. Alistair had arrived. The ancient doors burst open as veterans rushed inside. Gunfire shattered stained glass while swords clashed beneath collapsing arches. Rain poured through broken ceilings, turning stone floors dangerously slick. Alistair fought relentlessly toward Eleanor, forcing attackers backward with disciplined precision learned across countless campaigns. Cedric retreated upward into the crumbling bell tower, dragging Eleanor with him as his final shield. Lightning split the sky while ancient masonry cracked beneath the storm's fury. Standing above the abyss, Cedric laughed bitterly and admitted poisoning the banquet wine, arranging the hunting accident, bribing physicians, silencing witnesses, and murdering anyone whose loyalty threatened his inheritance. Hidden below, judges, investigators, and members of Parliament heard every word after secretly following the Duke to witness the exchange. Realizing too late that his own arrogance had condemned him, Cedric released Eleanor and reached for his pistol just as the fractured bell tower groaned violently beneath them, the ancient stones beginning to give way under everyone's feet. The ancient bell tower trembled beneath the violence of the storm as cracked stones broke loose and crashed into the ruined courtyard below. Cedric lunged toward the fallen pistol, but the weakened floor collapsed beneath his feet before his fingers could reach it. He clung desperately to a fractured beam, his elegant composure replaced by raw terror. Duke Alistair caught Eleanor and pulled her safely across the unstable platform while loyal veterans rushed upward through the spiraling staircase. Judges, investigators, and members of Parliament arrived moments later, witnessing Cedric's frantic struggle and hearing his earlier confession repeated by every survivor present. Surrounded by undeniable evidence and with nowhere left to flee, Cedric surrendered. Iron shackles replaced jeweled cuffs as officers led him away through the rain. The man who had hidden behind charm and influence for 6 years left the abbey defeated, exposed, and utterly alone. Silence followed the storm more powerfully than thunder. Alistair stood among broken stones staring into the darkness where so many years of fear had begun. Eleanor stepped beside him without speaking. She did not offer comforting speeches or empty promises. Instead, she simply reached for his hand. For a brief moment he hesitated, haunted by the belief that every hand he accepted would eventually be taken from him. Then his fingers slowly closed around hers. The warmth of another human touch felt unfamiliar, almost impossible, yet it remained. Nothing terrible happened. No unseen tragedy stole the moment away. Only the rain continued falling, gently washing soot and blood from the ancient stones. The following weeks transformed England. Parliament publicly reopened every investigation connected to House Ravenscroft. Physicians corrected false records. Witnesses who had hidden for years finally emerged under royal protection. Isabella's sacrifice became known throughout the kingdom, restoring her honor and exposing the courage she had carried until her final breath. Alistair's younger brother was recognized as the victim of deliberate sabotage rather than misfortune. His mother's mysterious illness was revealed to have been caused by repeated poisoning administered through a trusted household servant bribed by Cedric. The disappearance of the Duke's closest friend ended with the discovery of letters proving he had uncovered the conspiracy shortly before his murder. Piece by piece, the lies collapsed beneath the weight of truth. People who had once whispered about curses now whispered about courage. The same newspapers that had called the Duke dangerous printed lengthy apologies and praised his years of quiet generosity. Veterans openly described the commander who never abandoned wounded soldiers. Widows spoke of anonymous pensions that had saved their families. Orphans visited schools bearing the Ravenscroft name, finally learning the identity of the benefactor who had changed their lives. Alistair accepted none of the praise with satisfaction. He believed justice belonged to those who could no longer speak for themselves. Eleanor remained at his side without allowing admiration to become worship. She challenged him whenever guilt returned and reminded him that surviving did not dishonor the dead. Together they visited Isabella's resting place beneath an ancient yew tree overlooking peaceful countryside. Eleanor placed fresh white lilies upon the grave while Alistair quietly thanked the woman he had loved for saving his life at the cost of her own. He promised that her sacrifice would never again be remembered as a tragic accident. It would forever be honored as an act of extraordinary love. Winter gradually surrendered to spring. New gardens bloomed across Ravenscroft Manor, replacing neglected corners left untouched during years of mourning. Windows remained open. Music returned to rooms that had known only silence. Servants smiled more freely, no longer fearing that happiness itself might invite another calamity. Even the old tea table from the royal balls was moved onto a sunlit terrace where Alistair and Eleanor often shared quiet afternoons discussing hospitals, schools, and the future instead of ghosts from the past. Their partnership deepened because neither tried to rescue the other from every sorrow. Eleanor understood that grief never disappeared completely. Alistair accepted that courage did not mean living without fear but choosing not to surrender to it. Together they expanded medical care into isolated villages where physicians rarely traveled. Disabled veterans received permanent rehabilitation homes. Widows found meaningful employment instead of pity. Children who had lost parents to war received scholarships funded jointly by the Ravenscroft estate and the Ashcombe family. Compassion became the foundation of everything they built together. One bright summer morning beneath flowering chestnut trees, Alistair invited Eleanor to walk beside the quiet lake bordering the estate. The water reflected drifting clouds while swans glided peacefully across its glass-like surface. He stopped near the same wooden bench where he had once sat alone after Isabella's funeral, convinced happiness had ended forever. Looking into Eleanor's calm eyes, he removed a simple velvet box from his pocket. "I spent 6 years leaving an empty chair beside me," he said softly. "Not because I believed I deserved loneliness, but because I feared losing anyone else." She listened without interrupting. "I cannot promise a life without sorrow." "I would never ask for one," she replied. "I can only promise that every day I have left will be lived honestly, gratefully, and beside you if you'll allow it." Tears shimmered gently within her eyes as she nodded. "That is exactly the life I hoped for." He placed the ring upon her finger. Neither grand speeches nor cheering crowds witnessed the proposal. Only birdsong, summer light, and quiet certainty blessed the moment. Their wedding that autumn became one of England's most celebrated occasions because it represented hope restored after years of needless suffering. Veterans formed an honor guard outside the village church. Children from orphanages scattered flower petals along the path. Elderly servants whom Alistair had quietly supported stood proudly among honored guests. Dr. Ashcombe embraced his new son with genuine affection, grateful that kindness rather than ambition had united the families. Several months later the annual Royal Charity Ball returned to Ravensshire Hall. Crystal chandeliers once again bathed the ballroom in golden light. Violins welcomed elegantly dressed guests onto the polished floor. The familiar tea table waited beside the dancers exactly where it had stood for years. Instinctively, society left the neighboring chair empty before the Duke arrived. Old habits surrendered slowly. When Alistair entered, conversations softened with respectful warmth rather than fearful whispers. He greeted veterans, judges, servants, and palace staff with equal courtesy before taking his seat. For one brief instant the empty chair reminded him of every lonely evening that had come before. Then the great doors opened. Eleanor stepped inside wearing an elegant ivory gown whose graceful simplicity reflected everything he loved about her. She crossed the ballroom with the same calm confidence that had first astonished England. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody dared whisper against her. Smiling warmly, she reached the table, looked directly at Alistair, and said, "I believe this seat belongs to me now." His answering smile transformed his face more completely than any victory ever had. He rose, pulled the chair back for her, and waited until she was comfortably seated before taking his own place beside her. Their hands found one another beneath the table exactly as they had in the ruined abbey, only now there was no fear, no secrecy, and no shadow waiting above. The orchestra resumed its waltz as the entire ballroom applauded. Years later, when their children asked why their parents always insisted on sitting side by side, Alistair gathered them close and answered with quiet gratitude, "Because one brave woman taught me that loneliness was never protection. It was only another prison, and love was the key that finally opened its door."